Hello everybody, welcome to Complex Business Made Simple. My name is Marco Zanzottera and I'm trying to simplify business topics that are usually perceived as complex and give you an understanding of what's really happening behind the scene. I hope you'll find this useful and you'll enjoy it. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name is Marco Zanzottera. I am an industrial engineer, although I've been working in different capacities as a consultant, as change manager. Now I'm actually leading the operations of an e-commerce company in Germany. I started a project called Complex Business Made Simple, which is essentially my attempt to simplifying some of the complex business practices that are out there and people talk about, or they become big corporate jargon or big corporate words, and show how these are actually not complex. Maybe they're complicated, but it's actually quite straightforward. So in this particular episode, I'm going to talk about how to map business processes. It's an extremely useful application of a business activity, and it's versatile. It can apply to many different circumstances and projects. People mistakenly think that business process mapping is just a collection of flowcharts, but really there's a lot more. You can achieve efficiencies. You can achieve, you can maximize your productivity. You can understand what the bottlenecks are. You can even copy some best practices or some things that are working in a particular spot elsewhere in your organization. So it's a really quite a powerful thing. So let's see what this entails. So first thing, I'm not talking about finance. I know this are usually common disclaimers in the finance world, but the important thing is that we're talking about making changes to an organization, making changes to processes, and processes as well as organizations are made of people. So if you are at any point unsure that about what you're doing, on how to proceed, and even if you have doubts, please reach out to professionals. There are people that are doing this for a living, and there's a reason for that. Keep always in mind that the content of this presentation and all the other presentations that I'm releasing are simplified. This is the intent of the presentation, to make complex business simple, but there's a lot of different shades and things to consider. So again, don't be afraid of asking for help. There are professionals that can help you. So before we start, what is a business process? Well, I took the liberty of taking the definition from Wikipedia, adapting it a little bit, but essentially a business process is a collection of related structured activities or tasks that are performed by people with or performed by equipment, like say tools, documents, but it can be IT systems as well, in which a specific sequence produces an output. So the idea is that you have a process, you may receive some input, there are some activities, some tasks that are being carried out, and then there's an output that is being given to a customer. A customer can be an internal customer, but an external customer. There are different types of processes and sizes. A process can be as big as a lead to customer, so from where you actually scout a lead on the market until when you turn into a customer, but they can be as small and as atomic, if you want to call them like that, as quotation follow-up. So there is no strict rule about how you name your processes, how deep you have to go, but there are definitely a lot of standards and best practices out there. So don't reinvent the wheel. Have a look at what's out there, what fits your bill. I've shown you here something that usually works in many cases and in different circumstances, big and small companies as well. So what are processes, business processes? To simplify this to the full extent, think of processes like if you have ovens in a bakery, right? Maybe this is my European background, but you put stuff inside the oven, say some dough, and then the oven does something with it. You close the door, you don't know exactly what happens, but the oven cooks the dough, and then a more valuable product comes out, say a cake or bread or whatever. There could be different people that are providing input. So say you're the pastry master that just puts the dough together, then there's somebody else that comes and checks the oven or whatever. There could be different systems. Maybe it's not just the oven, then you maybe have to remove it, put it somewhere else, and then, So it's bear with me, it's a very loose definition, but it's something that I think could simplify the understanding of a process a lot. So who's this presentation for? Essentially, this is for people that want to find inefficiencies in teams or in activities within the company. This sounds a bit like a negative point to start with, but really there's a lot of teams that are actually high performers and maybe sometimes get stuck at really simple things. So these mapping processes can definitely aid in this issue. You may want to identify mistakes, blockers, or bottlenecks in a process. This is useful, especially if you want to pursue a standard like a quality standard like ISO 9001, or sometimes, like I mentioned before, you want to replicate best practices that you observe somewhere and you want to replicate and bring them somewhere else. This is also something that could work. Sometimes you just simply want to understand what happens in a given business process. How many times, I talk to line managers, or I experienced this myself, that things come and they enter into a process, people take care of things, not better defined things, and then all of a sudden there's an output, and you just can't put your hands on what exactly is happening. So mapping processes can definitely help you. And another very, very common scenario is when you're rolling out new applications, new IT applications. Say I'm thinking of CRMs, ERP tools. I've covered this in other presentations. Mapping processes can help a lot, and actually is necessary before you do these things. What can you expect out of this presentation? First thing, we'll cover the framework, so how to organize work so that you can achieve the results that you're after. Then we'll quickly look at what describes a process. People, like I said, mistakenly think that processes are just flowchart. There's actually a lot more, so much so that flowcharts are relegated to a single chapter in this presentation. Prep work, there's a lot of prep work that goes into the mapping processes, especially because, as you'll see, you'll have to deal a lot with different people, and you have to prepare these interviews that you will be doing, essentially. Then we'll get into the core of process mapping. What do you need to map? How do you go about this? Which tools do you need? Maybe some tips and tricks as well. And then last but not least, different scenarios. Okay, why are you mapping a process? What happens next? So there are many reasons why you want to map a process, but the idea is you may want to tailor your approach depending on what you're thinking of doing next. So let's dive into the framework to start with. Then the first thing that you want to do is essentially understanding how you want to organize your work, because you most likely will not embark in such a project alone, or even if you do, you want to make sure that you can find the information that you've mapped and you can present it back, and especially you want to use it. So as you see, the output of this organization, or how we organize the work, is essentially 2 big files and then a bunch of flowcharts if you want. But the idea is that, first of all, you have to have an index like in a book. And the idea is that you may want to organize processes in a hierarchy so that you understand where each and every process actually lies. The important thing is that these processes, of course, you will see them side by side, but it doesn't mean that they happen in a chronological way, but you may have different processes at different levels. So you may have the head process, which is, say, sales process, and then you will have, under the sales processes, you will have lead to quote, quote to order, and order to invoice. And then under order to invoice, you want to maybe have order fulfillment, and then invoice generation, invoice payment collection, etc., etc. So, payment collection, you can argue that it's sales process, but nonetheless, it's part of breaking up your work into different hierarchies. Why would you want to do that? Again, like I mentioned, this is probably very close to what an index is in a book. So you can always find where you're at. And whenever you're mapping a process, you can also share with others and show them, look, we are here. And it's part of the sales process. We are in the order to invoice sub-process, and we're actually mapping the invoice creation. So people can sort of get a context of where you're at, and it will also help you understand if you're missing some pieces, especially when you're looking at input, output, who are the owners of such processes. We'll cover all of this later. The last file that you want to have in your framework is essentially the collection of all the flowcharts. We'll get to this in a second. The important thing is that at this point you will end up with 3 files. One is, again, the summary file that we looked just in the previous slide, the index file that shows all the processes in a hierarchy. This is something that you can even print out and put on the wall. Just be ready, because it will most likely change as you try to understand which processes to map and how. And then, of course, all the collection of your sub processes and everything mapped in very convenient flowcharts. The interesting thing about this approach is that you will essentially have a collection that is organized, and it has essentially all the files easily consumable by other people that are not necessarily you. Again, you will most likely work with other people on this project, or you will have to create files that are consumed by other people or even maintained. Think about quality systems. You most likely map the processes, but then you hand it over to somebody else to maintain. Think about rollout of applications, IT applications. You will have to roll out and pass this process mapping to other consultancy firms or IT firms that are doing the implementation. So it's important that whatever you build is consumable by other people. And with that, let's step into the process description. How do you describe a process, besides the flowcharts that we were talking about? Think of process description as the ID card of your processes, where for humans you describe them by height, by address, by date of birth. In processes, you describe them by a bunch of properties that they have, and that it helps you identify and describe a process and understand where it sits. So let's start the parent process. The parent process is essentially telling you where the process sits in the process hierarchy. As you see in the index file, there's also a link to other processes, but understanding which one is the unique parent process of the process that you're analyzing definitely helps you in situations when you're interviewing people and you want to provide context, but also when you're validating your mapping with other people and you want to understand if you mapped correctly. So having an understanding of what the parent process is trivial. Scope. The scope essentially is understanding who else is involved in the process or is touched by the process, but is not necessarily an actor in the process. Think of it, if you are in the supply chain, you're mapping a supply chain process, and you understand that maybe part of the scope is actually a link to some of your suppliers. Your suppliers are touched by the process, although they're not maybe necessarily part of it. So sometimes knowing what the scope of your process will make you understand in later stages when you want to change something, or when you need to inform people about changes, it makes you understand who else may be touched, even maybe it's not in a big part of it. But it's extremely important that you understand and describe the scope. Going forward, target of the process. The idea describes why a process exists in the first place. It's important because sometimes you'll find that people or organizations are performing certain processes that maybe are not just inefficient, but they're not needed at all. Sometimes you want to wipe completely some processes away. This is actually something that you will do after the mapping, as you'll see, but understanding why a process exists, why a process is needed, is essentially describing what the target of the process. Then you have input and outputs. These are pretty self-explanatory. Input essentially are all this kind of information that, or documents, or in whichever form they come, that are needed for the process to work. If you are processing an invoice, then you would need information like the order number or who's the customer, etc. The output can be the information that the process gives, and again, in whichever form, can be the invoice itself, can be the document, can be some other bit of information like the invoice number. But essentially, this output is the value that the process creates. And usually outputs are consumed by other processes or by customers. You may find instances where customers or other processes or internal customers or IT system or anybody actually is using this output. In these instances, most likely you will want to challenge whether the output of the process is needed or if the whole process itself is needed. Moving forward, you want to add triggers. So triggers is essentially what kickstart the process, what makes the process begin its work. They could be triggers coming from other processes, like another process generate an output. So I'm generating the invoice and the next process is sending the invoice to the customer. It can be something generated manually by an external entity, say a customer calling, and then the support process starts. Or it could be a time event, something that happens frequently or every once in a while. So every month you need to do reconciliation. So this triggers the process of reconciliation. There's many different types of triggers. The important thing is that you understand what is actually triggering your process. If a process is not triggered, then it means that the process will most likely never run. Responsibility, again, you will see that there are many actors, many stakeholders involved in the process, but there's always one person that retains the responsibility, the overall responsibility of the process. Again, if I'm looking at invoice creation, this is most likely the CFO, even though I doubt that the CFO will actually go and create invoices, especially in big organizations where maybe there's many employees or ERP systems in place. So Who is the person responsible to make sure that the process runs and runs smoothly? Then you will look at metrics and measurements. You want to understand what are the KPIs, or the key process indicators that describe a process. The important thing is that these are important to monitor that particular process, making sure that the process is efficient or that the process is effective. So you can think of many different KPIs. Again, this is outside the scope of this presentation, but there's plenty of material on the internet as well available for free. Then we have the process mapping. Again, this is the collection of files, the descriptive flowcharts that I was mentioning before. There's a whole section dedicated to this, so I will not spend too much time on this. And then you may want to include other details. And these are depending on the scope or the scenarios of the reasons why you're mapping the processes. Especially if you're mapping processes to make changes, you may want to have distribution lists. So when you do pursue changes, you know who to talk with, you know who needs to be informed, you know who needs to be trained sometimes in pursuing changes. So having distribution lists can be useful in different projects. Maybe it's not as useful in, quality systems. So in quality systems, you may want to grasp variants to make sure that you cover them in your manual, for instance. So there are many other details that can go into a process, but I think the most important ones are the ones that I've listed so far. One last thing before we proceed. In this presentation, we are mapping the processes as they are today. That means that we are mapping what is called the as is, and essentially is describing what the process is doing today. There may be different reasons why you're mapping the process. Most likely you will want to roll out new applications, or you want to make changes. What the processes will look like after you roll out the application or after you make changes, so what is called the to be, is outside the scope of this presentation. Nonetheless, I included some slides later on in case you want to, with some tricks and tips in case you want to pursue this kind of projects. So let's dive into prep work. What do you need to prepare before you actually start diving into interviews? So the final goal of this is essentially thinking about your approach, if I have to summarize it in a single thing. Thinking about why you're doing things. So if you're mapping things because you want to roll out a new solution, a new software solution, be it an ERP, a CRM, or whatever, during the interview process, you want to pay particular attention to the pains that people raise. You want to start mapping your stakeholders, understanding their propensity towards the project. Are these people collaborative? Are these people suggesting new improvements because they care about this, or are they scared about this process? Some people may come with wish lists. These are very much connected to the pain points. So all of these things is something that will definitely help you in your change management project, but also in rolling out a successful application. Instead of looking maybe at restructuring the process for whatever other reason, it's also important to understand the details and the variance of the process. Sometimes, as we'll see later, the processes are not pursued the way you expect. People take shortcuts to try and make their life simpler or to speed up the work in some way. So understand what the variants are, understand what people really are doing. So think about your approach. How can you get the most out of your interviews? So a few things to guide you. The first question would be, who should map the process? So if you're the person owning the process, or if you're involved in the process in the sense that you're actually pursuing work, you may want to consider asking somebody else to interview you. You can obviously map the process yourself. It's not a bad practice, but having somebody else usually helps you think about all the little changes and the little shades that you wouldn't otherwise think, and you just assume, and they're just essentially your bias. So again, having someone that can help you asking questions and how does this work, how do you come to this document, can sometimes aid the process. Otherwise, if you are mapping somebody else's process, you can obviously go ahead and interview people yourself. Sometimes if you're interviewing people that are not in your department, this can create some obviously politics. So be mindful of where you're going and involving all the stakeholders, and especially be mindful of setting the stage. I'll talk about this later. The important thing is you want to measure what you're doing. You're not mapping process just for the fun of it. Sometimes if you want to pursue improvement in efficiency or in the effectiveness of your processes, it's important that you have a benchmark. Sometimes you pursue processes or you are running processes without measuring their output or without measuring their efficiency. Again, if I go back to creating the invoice processes, you may not measure how many invoices you're creating or how fast is the creation of the invoice. But if you're trying to pursue improvements in these, number of invoices being generated in a unit of time, or in general, the number of invoices that a single person can generate, then again, it's important to have an initial benchmark, even if you have no metrics to start with. The next question that you want to ask yourself is, who should I interview? Who can help me map the process? My experience suggests that who does the job usually knows best. I've seen managers trying to map the processes carried out by some of their reports. This usually miss a lot of important details, especially if you want to pursue changes, or if the details are important because of, an application that you're rolling out. The people that are doing the job will essentially try and change the process with time to make it more efficient, to go around bottlenecks, or to make their life easier for that matter. So having the person that does the job in the interview is key. How do I prepare for the interview? My suggestion is you are taking information out of somebody's head. And as bad as it sounds, it's important that the other person trusts you. So be open about why you're doing this. Be open about the output that you're trying to generate. Be open to actually receive suggestions, receive feedback, and put the person at ease. It's important that you focus on the person that you're interviewing. If the person that you're interviewing trusts you and genuinely sees that you are genuine with them, then this helps a lot in process mapping. Make them comfortable, and especially if there are long interviews that can go for hours, or that you're meeting them multiple times, it's important that you win them over. So what is your role in the interview? Your role is purely to moderate the conversation. You're there as a listener, and not to provide suggestions, not to provide your point of view, not to provide ideas on how to make things better. So always keep this in mind, because you'll end up hearing plenty of things that you will disagree with, or that you definitely see that they're inefficient. But bear with the interviewee, because you may find out that they're doing this for a reason. Most likely that's the case. And most likely you will not have the complete picture, or the interviewee will not have the complete picture. So this can jeopardize the complete interview. So put yourself in a very, very humble position. You're there to purely moderate the conversation, map the process. When I say moderate the conversation, means that you have to map the process tasks, so the events, what happens, in a chronological way. So think of it like a little boxes. Generating the invoice means understand the order number, put the order number in a field, add the line items, calculate the total, etc., etc. So your conversation would be, if a person says, oh, look, I take the order number and then I have the total, you have to ask questions. Okay, how do you get to the total? So you guide the conversation. So that you make sure that your flowchart is clean. Don't hide the flowchart. Show them the flowchart as you're creating this, because this, having a picture in mind can help, especially the more visual people, understanding what you're trying to do, and make sure they are not skipping any step. The important thing is that, again, if you want to pursue the trusting path that I was mentioning before, offer help if you can help later on. So be genuine with the person. If you know that you're there that because you're mapping a new process to roll out a new application, make sure that you note down all the pain points of the person, all the suggestions that they have, and then not only they will provide you a better picture of the situation, but they will also give you a chance to go and action these items later. And just like that, we are into process mapping. So this will show you how to map processes, what do you need in terms of tools, and maybe some tips and tricks to make your mapping life a lot easier. Let's start with the tools. So I mentioned the 3 files before. The summary file, so the table, just to give it a different name, usually it's as simple as using a text editor. You don't want to complicate things. Your focus should be on interviewing people and making sure that your processes are mapping correctly. So use the tools for what they are, something to make your life easier. So usually a text editor like Word or LibreOffice Writer or any of those Google Docs and the like can do. If you're very, very familiar with Excel, I don't like to bend programs of what they are not, but Excel can help you also maintaining the relationships between one project and the other and create internal links. I mean, Word does too, but Excel can be helpful in sorting and filtering things as well. So find what works for you. Just make sure that maintaining this document doesn't become a burden. It's this tool that should help you, not the other way around. The index file, so the file with all the process hierarchy, and as well, but this applies to also the small flowcharts or the collection of flowcharts that you will be doing, can be done in a variety of programs. I have been using in my consulting life Visio a lot. Visio is extremely powerful, also comes at a price, obviously. I know there's a Mac alternative with OmniGraffle. I'm a big believer of open source, so on Linux I've been using Dia as well. But there's also online solutions like Whimsicles or Diagrams.net. Obviously, those come with a subscription fee. There's some basic functionality that is free. But again, the important thing is that you find what works for you and makes your life simple. I've been mapping processes on paper, usually, to start with, pen and paper. And then I copy them in this project or in these programs so that I can edit them later. But I think because of the focus of the interview should be around the mapping, I usually prefer plain pen and paper. When you produce a file, however, think about who will consume the file. So you don't want to create a non-editable file, say a PDF, and then have the person who receives the PDF, the stakeholder, the client, not being able to edit this in the future if they need to. So make sure that you give something that can be future-proof. The second thing is think how they will consume the file. So if you end up handing over a VSD file or something that it's editable, make sure that the person can open the file. So maybe think about giving two versions, maybe a PDF and the editable file so that they can have a look. Especially if you use an online solution, make sure they can log in or that the file is exposed to the public, maybe password protected somehow. If you are planning to work collaboratively, pick a solution that allows you to do that. Not all the solutions that I mentioned allow you to do that. The online solutions do, obviously, but also they have some limitations. So make sure you check all these things. And then also understand what the complexity of work is. Sometimes you just want to use PowerPoint. If the scope of mapping the process is a single presentation, map it on paper, put it into PowerPoint. It's as simple as that. Let me give you an example of an application. I just tried to pick an example that everyone can relate to. In this particular case, I'm looking at a bakery. So if you look at a bakery, we'll have some main processes like sales, like cooking and replenishment, like inventory, making sure you have enough flour, water, salt, and everything, but also running the business, so facilities and administration, finance, and everything. For the sake of this exercise, let's try to keep this process simple. We'll look at sales. So the sales process kicks in when a customer enters the bakery. So we'll look at what all these symbols mean later on, but essentially the first thing you will do is queue management if there's more than one customer in the shop, and then the selection of the items, so picking and weighing the items, then there will be packing, and finally the payment. So let's go through some key shapes that we'll see. It's not a complete list, there's actually a lot more, but these shapes are usually found in every flowchart that you will look at. The first one is a filled-in circle, shows where the process starts. It's not an actual activity per se, but it's just a placeholder so you know exactly where to start looking, where to start reading your process. The counterpart of it is where the process ends, is a circle with an outline, and it's placed usually after all the activities has been pursued. Then you will have the actual process. It's this arrow shape. This is applied to every process, every step of the hierarchy. Doesn't matter if it's the main process, if it's a sub-process, it's a container, or whatever. It's usually used, as you'll see, to contain all the activities as well as showing relationship with other processes. You will have the trigger. It's like a table with a flag on the side. The trigger describes the event that triggers the process, if the process is triggered by anything. Then you will have this choice, it's a diamond. The diamond essentially, sometimes the process splits, the flow splits if you have to make a choice. So say the customer in the bakery wants something more, yes or no. So the diamond describes the choice. There could be more than two choices as well. So going forward to the second set of key shapes, the flow of your process or the activities direction, as you want to call it, is shown by simple arrows, filled in arrows. But the flow of information, the information can come in or out of the process, or go out of the process, are shown by dotted lines, arrows. Informations are shown by these trapezoid kind of documents. They're not very fancy, but it's for simplicity of reading. And then you will have the actual activities, the tasks that you have performed that are just this rounded shape. Last but not least, a very important one is the swim lane. Swim lane essentially collects and clusters tasks and information and events under a particular person or team. So it shows who are the stakeholders, who are the actors that are pursuing these activities. How do you map? So essentially the process is just sitting in an interview with a person and then interviewing the person, asking him or her to go through the step, and then you sort of write down on your piece of paper or on your software the things that are happening. The important things to think about, I mentioned some of this before, make the person feel at ease, bring some snack, have some chit chats, make sure that the atmosphere is less formal than it should be. You are trying to get information out of this person, so be upfront with them and be genuine. You're there to guide the discussion, I mentioned this before. So make sure that things are coming in a chronological event. If you see that you're splitting the process in different branches because maybe you have choices of different variants, make sure that you go back and guide the person through the process of analyzing all the other variants. Making sure that you're mapping the process as it is. Again, I mentioned before that sometimes you just can't help to provide suggestions, or the person on the other end can already see some improvements and they will suggest themselves some improvements. Make sure that you keep the conversation on what the process looks like today, and make sure that you're mapping the real process. You will hear a lot of, this actually should happen, but in reality, we are doing this. So make sure that you're mapping the reality, because what should happen obviously is not happening for a reason. So you want to map the actual process as it is today. Important thing, don't forget the exceptions. Exceptions are things that can obviously drag you down in rabbit holes. So you start describing, if an invoice is coming from a different countries, or if the customer is one of our top customers, or manage this. So sometimes understand what needs to be mapped and map it, or put it aside and just be aware that there are exceptions and map them only if it's needed. How to map the process? From my experience, the best or the most common way of doing this that usually works most of the time is a top-down approach. So start to map the big processes, say the sales process, and then all the other sub-processes, and then go down into the atomic activities while you map all the different sub-processes. Keep track of this in your process map, because you'll inevitably have to move processes and sub-processes around, but usually using a top-down approach, make sure that you're not missing anything. Going back to our example of the bakery, again, you have your main processes: sales, cooking, replenishment, inventory. The sub-process of sales are queue management, selection, packing, and payment. If you go into selection, your selection process will look something like this. So you'll see you will have the big background, not the bread, but the actual shape of the process is the container of the process. You'll see the two big rectangles. One is the employee and one is the customer. So who does what? You can see on the left side the originating process, which is queue management, and also the triggers. Customer enters empty bakery. So the trigger of this process can be a customer waiting in line or a new customer because your bakery is empty. And then you see the big black circle. This is the beginning of the process. It begins with the employee greeting the customer and then obtaining the request from the customer. And the customer provides information like which product do they want and in which quantity. Then the employee goes back, weigh the item, confirm with the customer and says, I weighted this much and this is the price, and then checks if the customer needs more products. So this is the diamond. So the customer needs more products, then it gets pushed back into obtain requests. If that's not the case, then we'll go into consolidating the order. At this point, we're mapping the picking process. So this is finished, and then the next process will be packing. I'd like to reiterate on some suggestions that I already gave. Some of these are really important, so I would like to mention them again. The first one is remember that you're modeling the behavior of your process. So you'll end up in the trap of wanting to put more and more details. Sometimes these details are irrelevant. They will not change the flow of the process. They will not help you in what you're trying to do next. So make sure you trim out the relevant details. This will come with experience, will come with more and more interviews that you're doing, but will also be guided by the next steps. So the reason why you're mapping the process. When you're clarifying or discussing parts of the process, show what you're mapping to your interviewee. It will help both of you following the trail and also understand if you're missing some steps. Talking of showing what you're mapping, I mentioned before, using pen and paper can be invaluable. I know it's a very analog approach, but it helps also creating an atmosphere of trust. For a start, it will not have a screen between you two, but it also helps in looking at the process that you've mapped so far and in making changes if you need. Once you're pretty confident that your process is actually final, or it's a good version of your process, run it again from the beginning to the end with your interviewee or with the managers to make sure that you haven't forgotten anything. And maybe some other people will actually add some things, and this can be details, they can be variants, they can be systems or documents that maybe one person didn't know. Sometimes you want to go backwards in a process. So I mentioned before the bakery, where your first step is actually greeting the customer and ends up with consolidating the order. Sometimes you want to start from consolidating the order and walking back. What happens before consolidating the orders? So that helps understanding which activities you have to do in order to be able to consolidate the order. Of course, you need to have the goods. So what do you have to do before that? You have to collect the goods. Before you have to collect the goods, you have to have the information. So going backwards usually helps in understanding and making sure that you mapped all the steps. It's a bit counterintuitive, but you'll find that after a few instances of this exercise, you will definitely see the value. So this is essentially how the whole thing will look like. You will have your top index file at the top, where you have all your processes. This is obviously not a complete version because it doesn't show the sub-processes, but you will have the top processes, then you will have the sub-processes, and then you will have the sub-processes with all the activities and tasks. There's no set rule on how many levels a process should have. My suggestion is it should be 3 for most activities, so that you don't spend too much time in details or in sub processes. But again, you have to adapt this methodology or this exercise to what you're trying to do. So just try to make it simple, and like everything you do in life, make sure that it works for what you want to achieve. Last but not least, scenarios. So yes, we mapped the process, we have all the documents. Now what? Like I said, there are different scenarios or different reasons why you want to map processes. I mentioned rollout of applications. I also mentioned certifications. You want to achieve, you want to create a new quality system for your organization. Sometimes you just simply want to set up metrics and performance indicators to make sure that you are mapping and you're understanding how the process is working and whether it is working properly. Maybe there are, business process reengineering. You want to change things just for improving the process or for, adapting through a merge or acquisition. There could be many reasons why you want to do business process reengineering. So I'm trying to give you a few scenarios on what happens and what you could do in each situation. Again, this is not a comprehensive thing, but let's start with the rollout of applications. There are a few things that you need to pay attention during the mapping exercise. Map the unspoken things. This is a very, very hard thing to do, but sometimes you can feel that there's some bottlenecks or there's some frustration that users experience when doing a particular task. So the applications can aid in solving this. So make sure that you map and you grasp those things. Collect the name of the applications and the files that users are using today, because these will most likely have to be integrated or changed or collected in some way and adapted. So if you can, obtain a copy and then attach it to your file. Just as important, collect the improvements that people are thinking about. There are people that are more vocal than others in showing or suggesting improvements, but make sure that you're not dwelling on it during the interview. The interview is mapping the processes. The improvements is something that you can discuss in a later stage, especially once you have a clear idea of the overall process, not just that particular one. Alongside the improvements, you may also collect a wish list, so a letter to Santa of what people would want. Again, write things down, collect them, but keep focusing on the process. After the interviews, you may want to look at the implementation metrics. These are important because you need to understand during the rollout of an application how your implementation is going. Is this successful? Are users adapting to the new process, to the new application? So this is important because you want to make sure that what you're doing actually eventuates in something useful, in something valuable for the organization. Alongside the implementation metrics, there are business metrics. Business metrics is, say you're rolling out a CRM, you want to have a more efficient sales process, so you want to have a bigger pipeline or you want to increase your sales. So those are business metrics. They're not necessarily connected to the way you do the implementation, but they're connected to the fact that you're rolling out a CRM. So make sure you have distinct clusters of metrics, the implementation ones alongside the business ones. The important thing is, after the interview, go back, look at your process, understand where the bottlenecks are, and try to understand how the application that you're rolling out can solve them. Or if not the application itself, try to understand if there's any way that you can change the process slightly or completely to sort of change these bottlenecks and turn them into efficiencies instead. A generic suggestion, rolling out application is purely a change management project. So treat it as such. Means make sure you understand who your stakeholders are, make sure you do proper training, communication is key. So again, all of these things are extremely important. Mapping processes is just one of the activities of rolling out applications. If you're looking at certifications, say you want to pursue a ISO 9001 quality system, the important thing is that I wouldn't focus too much on the details. The more details you put in your file, the more details are to be maintained in the future versions of the files. Also, the auditors that will come and audit your company will go and make sure that these details are actually true. And if these details are only true in certain circumstances, then they can also raise reasons for concerns or some incidents as well. So it can be going as far as failing your certification. So make sure you don't focus too much on the details, but grab the things that are important for the certification, especially files and documents. These are important because they most likely have to be part of your quality system, and so they have to become control documents. So these are extremely crucial. After the interview, needless to say, make sure that the process actually works as it's expected to, and the people that are actually involved in the process know how the process works. When the auditors will come, they will look at your flowchart, your process description, and then they will go and make sure that the process runs with the people that are running the process. So make sure that these people are not doing something different from what you mapped, because otherwise this will definitely raise a concern. And the other thing is you make sure that you put mechanisms in place to monitor that the process is working efficiently and is working as it should. Again, generic suggestions, simplify the model as much as possible, make sure that you can maintain it in the future. So the more complexity you add, the more time you will have to spend in maintaining the process and the documents. And then again, when you pick tools, make sure that they're future-proof. So, if you are sharing the files with somebody else, maybe you are mapping the process, but somebody else is maintaining the files, make sure that they have access to the tools and the software to maintain these files. Setting up metrics, if you're mapping process because you want to control them, it's important that you try to get a feeling of what is the pain that you or your stakeholders are trying to solve. Don't start from what you want to measure, but start from what is your output. Focus on the output. What is your process doing? Why is it important that you're measuring this? So if you start from this, you may sometimes realize that you want to measure the wrong thing to start with, and maybe you have some biases in this. It's nothing wrong. It's actually quite a new eureka moment. But again, my strong suggestion is focusing on the output. After the interview, think of the information in your process. What does this relate to? If this information relates to a process that is outside the one that you're currently mapping, make sure that this is not causing bottlenecks, that there are no politics that are hindering your effectiveness or the efficiency of the process, etc., etc. And then last but not least, you have to measure the process. So who is actually responsible to do this, to measure the process? How often is it supposed to happen? How is this reported? Who is the receiver of this metric? How is this distributed? Does it go in a dashboard? Does it come via email? Does it go to the C-level suite? All of these things need to be addressed. My suggestion is, again, differentiate the implementation metrics from the business metrics. Even setting up metrics is part of the implementation. So if you have metrics around the process, implementing a process or implementing changes, these are different from the actual business metrics that you are trying to affect sometimes. So business process reengineering, or BPR, this is possibly one of the most common reasons why people map processes. Everything that we mentioned in the rollout of applications apply here. So make sure you grab and write down the pain points, the wish list, the unspoken things when you're talking with your interviewees. This will help you in creating the new version of the process, or the 2B. So yeah, that's the first thing. After the interview, you want to focus on where you need to apply changes. So don't embark in actually looking at everything, because otherwise you lose focus and you'll end up not getting anywhere. Start from the information, how you handle the information. Is there anything that gets handed back and forth? This usually is an inefficiency. Sometimes it can be helped. Sometimes, more often than not, it can be solved by making changes here and there. So since you're re-engineering the process, you may want to look at that. Make sure that if you're making changes, there is no change in responsibility that is blocking the process. You may want to discuss if there are changes in responsibilities. It's absolutely fine, but make sure that you actually know and can manage this. and then look at the outputs, input and outputs, especially outputs. Is there anything that is generated but is not being used? It's an extreme case, but it happens more often than you think, especially when processes are across teams and one team produces something that they think another team will consume, but it's not always the case. Last but not least, look at the bottlenecks. Sometimes the process stops because they're waiting for input or approval, or they're waiting for somebody else to pitch in. So look at these things and see if there are ways you can improve this. As a generic suggestion, again, cluster your implementation metrics and your business metrics differently. Remember that change management is extremely important in business process reengineering projects. It's not just corporate jargon. You need to manage your stakeholders, engage with them, have a rock solid communication plan, involve everyone that needs to be involved. This is the only way your project will be successful. So one of the questions that I was asked when I first introduced my Complex Business Made Simple project to the social media world was, how do companies that are using Waterfall to pursue projects can migrate into Scrum, or what are the differences in the processes? The important thing that is worth mentioning is that here in this presentation I talked a lot about processes, and these are very different from methodologies. Methodologies are just approaches that you use to do something. So in the Waterfall and Scrum methodologies, essentially the goal is eventually the same. You want to facilitate the completion of projects. The approach that they use is slightly different. So you can, in a loose way, describe them as processes, in the fact that Waterfall goes from getting requirements and designing things before any sort of development starts. Whereas Scrum starts from the vision, creates user stories, and then there's sort of a loop in what goes in the product backlog, what gets implemented, and what goes back into the product backlog as improvements. It's a slight but very, very important difference. If you put them side by side, this is probably obvious for many people. If you look at the Waterfall versus the Agile methodologies, and Scrum being part of the Agile methodology, the important thing is that Waterfall needs to go into a linear stage, and as such, requirements must be clear from the start. Think of it, Waterfall, if you're building a house. You have to have the slab of cement first, and then you can build the fundaments, and then you start building the house. If you don't have these fundamental requirements to start with, then you can't build anything else. So the Waterfall is what is used, for instance, in construction. As such, once everything is decided, all the requirements are written down and designed, changing this can become cumbersome. It's really challenging. On the other side, Agile is more adaptive in this way. So obviously it can run in parallel workflows, mostly used obviously in software development, if you think about it, because you can build something and then reiterate and add functionalities and. So they are used in different things, but do not necessarily touch business processes as such. There could be like a huge discussion on how companies that have both of these processes, both of these methodologies used in different teams or in different areas can work. This could obviously touch business processes, but this is completely outside of the scope of this. So that was it. Thanks for bearing with me until now. It was a long presentation. I hope it gave you a good insight on how to map business processes, at least to get you started on this. There's a lot more resources available online, of course. I'll put this presentation in the comments and on my website. You can find the link there. If you have any questions or if you have feedback as well, I would love to hear this. Please reach out. I'm always available for a conversation. I'll be very, very happy to discuss any of this. One last important thing, these slides are not just my work. I actually run these slides and their context through a lot of people, to make sure that what I'm saying actually makes sense and it's understandable. I had help from people taking photos. So all the photos that you see in the presentation, or most of them actually, are shot by amazing video and photographers, friends and former colleagues. The logos that you see and the color scheme was actually created by Marxi, and I used obviously a lot of content available for free on the internet, so obviously having some credits is in order. So thanks a lot again for bearing with me, and please get in touch if there's anything that I can help with or that you would like to discuss or you have any questions. Have a good one. Bye bye.